Hi, everybody. We're just going to give it a few more minutes to let folks sort of filter in, but welcome. For those just joining us, we're going to give it a couple more minutes to let the crowd filter in, but welcome, and we're excited to get started soon. We'll be kicking it off in about 1 minute for those just joining. All right. Well, I'm seeing a healthy crowd of around 40 of you in the audience, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Is Manure Management a Revenue Opportunity? Unlocking Carbon Revenue with LWR and 3Degrees. My name is Graham Holmes. I'm here today in my role as Senior Marketing Manager at 3Degrees, and I'm thrilled to welcome all of you to today's session. Today, we're going to walk through exactly how LWR and 3Degrees are helping to transform manure management from an operational hurdle to a revenue opportunity. For that, I'm joined by two incredible industry experts who are on the front line of bringing these projects to life. We have Carly Lewis, Account Manager at LWR, and Ryan Stilson, Senior Project Development Manager at 3Degrees. Before I hand it over to Carly to kick us off, I just want to share a quick housekeeping note. Shri Artham, Supply Chain Reductions Lead Ag at 3Degrees, will be answering questions in the chat in real time, and we'll also have a brief Q&A following the webinar. So please drop all questions in the Q&A. With that, Carly, the floor is yours.
Perfect. Thanks, Graham. Thanks, everyone, for joining us here this afternoon or morning, depending where you are tuning in from. Appreciate you guys all taking the time to come in and listen. As Graham introduced, my name is Carly Lewis. I'm an account manager and certified crop advisor here with Livestock Water Recycling. Graham, you can go to the next slide if you want. And I've been with the company now for just over 5 years, about 5.5 years now. And my main job is I'm working with livestock producers to help determine more value on their farm from their manure management. From a certified crop advisor background, I really like to dig in on the nutrient management side of things with these farms to really see how we can increase the utilization of manure nutrients. And I also help producers identify new revenue opportunities through various environmental markets. And at Livestock Water Recycling, we're helping livestock producers unlock more value from their manure by transforming it into revenue generating assets. So their liquid manure treatment systems improve nutrient management, reduce storage and land application costs, create data and environmental outcomes needed to participate in all of these credit programs and opportunities that we're going to dig into a little bit more. I'm joined today with Ryan Stilson from 3Degrees, and I'll let him do a brief introduction for himself as well.
Yeah, thanks, Carly, and thanks everyone for joining today. My name's Ryan Stilson. I'm a senior manager on our project development team. I've been with 3Degrees for about 6 years, and I'm focused on finding emission reduction opportunities within the agriculture space, typically on farm and typically within livestock systems. 3Degrees is a global climate solutions provider. We've been around since 2002. We're about 250 employees globally. And our focus is helping large corporations reduce their scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. And we've been working in the livestock space within North America for a couple of decades now, navigating various environmental markets, both on the compliance and voluntary side. So we've been working with LWR for I think about 7 years now. So excited to dig in more on the different opportunities. Um, Graham, you could jump to the next slide here. So just quickly on the agenda, we're going to do a brief kind of carbon markets 101, describe how the process works from installing the system to generating credits, discuss kind of some of the revenue potential from this and some case studies associated with that, and then talk through what are the kind of key risks and other potential benefits of the system. And then finally, Carly's going to share some of the structures that LWR has in place for interested farms. Jump to the next slide, Graham. So just zooming way out, one carbon credit represents a ton of CO2 equivalent that's been either avoided, reduced, or removed from the atmosphere. There are dozens of carbon markets, different carbon markets globally, but the two that are most relevant to LWR systems are supply chain markets, which are also sometimes called insetting or within value chain markets, and then the voluntary carbon market being the second one. Just quickly on both of those different markets. So the supply chain market is mostly large food and bev brands who are looking upstream in their supply chain and looking at opportunities to reduce emissions on the farms that they ultimately source from. So for a lot of these companies, in some cases 90% or more of their total emissions are coming from the sort of on-farm portion of their supply chain. In other words, if you're thinking about like a chocolate bar, right? The majority of the emissions from that chocolate bar are happening upstream from the agricultural products that companies are sourcing to create that product. And so these companies in many cases have climate targets, whether it's an absolute reduction in their emissions or a net zero target by a certain date. And so in order for them to be able to hit those targets, they have to make a lot of progress on reducing emissions and having the highest impact, which is oftentimes working with farms that they source from. The voluntary carbon market extends kind of beyond agricultural products and geographies as well. It's a sort of a global market. And so project types include methane avoidance, like in this case, but it also could be like a forestry project or a cook stove project or renewable energy in some cases. And so buyers in the voluntary carbon market are generally not addressing their own business or their own supply chain, but they're looking for impact outside of their own value chain, and aligning sort of their dollars with projects that are reducing emissions elsewhere. And so in this case, when we do see some interest from voluntary buyers in a LWR style project, they're often looking at methane as a category, right? So they're methane being a super pollutant, they're looking at how can we make the most impact in the short term from a climate perspective, and methane is a strong lever for that. There's a lot of different nuance between the two markets and various kind of pathways within that, but the underlying sort of mechanics are pretty similar, right? Where you're taking a baseline practice, there's an intervention, in this case installing an LWR system, and then you're measuring, quantifying, and verifying those emission reductions, and then ultimately selling those to an buyer. So again, differences between the two, but the underlying process is similar. So I'll pass it to Carly to describe how methane is actually avoided via the LWR system.
Yeah, so we'll go to the next slide here. So as Ryan was saying of, these two different market spaces and how we connect that over then kind of at the farm level, what happens is LWR's first wave system, so that's our liquid solid separation technology that we have, can be implemented on farm to help achieve and generate these methane avoidance credits. And really at the core, when we're thinking of methane avoidance, we're looking at the volatile solids that are in manure. When your solids in your manure end up in your lagoon storages, your long-term lagoon storage, we see that breakdown of those volatile solids, and that breakdown then leads to the release of greenhouse gas emissions, including methane. So if we can effectively remove that volatile solid from ending up in that long-term storage, we can then see where we're having that avoidance happen in there. So we're avoiding that methane from potentially happening in the first place. So like I said, our first wave system is what we're using to achieve that. And LWR's first wave is the first system that was able to issue a chemical solid separation methane avoidance credit under the VERA registry, so the Verified Carbon Standard. And that was back 2023, I believe, is when that first one went through. And so really at the core of it, our technology is looking at a really high efficiency rate for liquid solid separation. So our system is looking at removing the total suspended solids, and a large majority of those total suspended solids contain volatile solids. So again, when we're removing, a high amount, say 85 to maybe 99% of your total suspended solids, with that, we're removing the majority of the volatile solids and effectively avoiding those solids from breaking down in the lagoon and releasing that methane. And all within that, we're having data collection take place with that. So in our first wave systems, we have fully automated systems that are collecting all of that intel of your manure stream coming in versus what's coming out of the system. And it's able to read, the exact numbers of, okay, what was that solids number feeding in versus what's coming out? We then take that actual data from your farms and are able to pass that along to the team at 3Degrees, who can then, input all of that data into their methodologies to determine how much volatile solid was removed and then how much effectively methane was avoided at that farm. And so again, Brian kind of mentioned it, but really when we think of, carbon credits or tons of CO2 equivalent, really they are, equal to each other. 1 ton of CO2 equivalent is equal to 1 carbon credit. So we may talk about that kind of interchangeably throughout the presentation, but have that just kind of in the back of your mind that, 1 ton is 1 credit worth of carbon credits. We'll go to the next slide, Graham, please. So then what does that really mean, when we get talking about this revenue opportunity that we're all here to learn more about? When we think of carbon credits and how we're going to achieve a methane avoidance credit, we first have to look at what the baseline is at the farm. And so every single farm, starts out with a baseline for their manure. And really that baseline is, what are you currently doing with your manure right now in your manure management plan? We need to know, how many cows do you have on your farm? How much manure are they making? Are you a flush system? Are you scraping your alleyways? Are your cows even in, freestall barns? Are they outside in open lot pens? All of these different factors get taken into consideration when we look at determining what the baseline is at the farm. And then through all of our data collection that we have at LWR, we've been able to model out what that potential reduction would look like based on what that farm's current manure management practice is. We look at then, okay, if we were to install an LWR system, this is the reduction. And that's how we can then determine, how many credits per cow per year that farm potentially could be making. So with a first wave system, we're looking at between kind of 4 to 8 credits per cow per year that we can generate on farm. And that range, again, really comes from what the baseline is at the farm. So what are your current operations? Do you have any separation? Are you doing any mechanical separation of, a screw press? Maybe you're trying to recover some of the bedding back. Maybe you have slope screens. Maybe you have a sand lane if you're bedding with sand. All of those pieces get taken into consideration when we're looking at how to determine where the carbon credits would be. And then we can take all of that. And then when we actually install the system, then we start collecting the data in real time on the farm to be able to prove out and essentially, validate what we said we think was going to happen. We can now actually prove that out with data on the back end. So then when we get thinking from the market perspective, as Ryan said, with our first wave system, we're looking at kind of those two market spaces, the voluntary carbon market and then the supply chain reduction market. And really, what we're looking at, as Ryan said, when we're thinking supply chain, we're looking, within the dairy industry, looking within their supply chain of, who do you sell your milk to? And if it's going to a processing plant, who's their end buyer of those products that they're making? That's who we're trying to target because those companies are the ones who have come out with their statements of, whether they want to be carbon neutral or they want to see carbon reductions. And so typically those supply chain reduction market spaces have a little bit higher dollar value to them. So when we think voluntary carbon market, which is, kind of the, wider bracket here of looking, historically, we've seen between $5 to $15 per ton versus when we get looking at the supply chain reductions, again, thinking within kind of the dairy supply chain going upwards, we're seeing more closer to, $40 and up per credit. And so we are really aiming to find buyers in that supply chain market so that we can get the most value possible for our farms because that makes the most sense in this whole process. So that's really our goal, is to look within that supply chain market space to see how can we get the most value possible for the farms. And I think now I'm going to pass it back to Ryan to kind of do a little bit more of a deep dive into the carbon credit kind of ecosystem and all the players involved. So I'll pass it over to Ryan, and I think we can go to the next slide.
Yeah, thanks, Carly. So yeah, just walking through the flow and the process a little bit here. So obviously it starts at the farm. The farm, again, as Carly mentioned, will understand the baseline manure management practice and collect the data that we need on that front. The farm then installs the LWR equipment and sort of any associated equipment that's required as well. On an ongoing basis, we'll require some operational data from the farm, things like herd counts and energy usage and things like that. But a lot of that data is sort of automatically being collected by LWR and passed on to us. So the main responsibilities for the farms are that baseline data, getting the system up and running, and sort of continuous operation with some operational data that's needed on an ongoing basis. LWR is obviously, highly important to the startup and install process, and provides ongoing sort of analytics and support for projects via that data collection. So the same information that they're collecting for us on the carbon side is also helping to inform projects on how to run the system more efficiently or make decisions on separation rates or uptime or those sorts of things. And so we're getting a lot of that data, again, kind of directly from LWR. 3Degrees will essentially, again, take the baseline data, take the operational data, take the data from LWR, and use third-party recognized and approved methodologies to calculate the emission reductions. And so once we have kind of that calculation and that justification and description of the project, we'll get that package verified by third parties. And I'll get into this process a little bit more on the next slide. But there are third-party sort of nonprofits or NGOs that run different standards and registries to accommodate sort of this carbon market ecosystem. Carly mentioned the Vera being one of them. Some others that exist in the U.S. are Climate Action Reserve or American Carbon Registry and things like that. And so those groups will set essentially a framework and requirements for, okay, what do you need to prove in order to get credits issued? And so we're following that depending on, again, which market we're pursuing for the project. Once those reductions and that quantification has been third party, validated and verified, the credits will issue on those registries. And then finally here, the buyers, again, either voluntary market or within supply chain, 3Degrees is managing the monetization for those credits in most cases. And again, market agnostic, just trying to find what is the best potential outcome for the specific farm. So you could jump to the next slide, Graham. So yeah, just digging into the verification and validation process a little bit more. So once a project is up and running, we will prepare what's called a project design document, or PDD. Um, in that PDD is essentially a description of, here's the project, here's the baseline scenario, here's the intervention and project scenario, here's our ongoing monitoring plan and how we have collected data and we'll continue to collect the data. We'll essentially submit that to a registry to get the project validated. So they're saying, okay, yes, this project is within the rules of our standard and our methodology. And that validation happens sort of upfront, and it happens in the first year, and then you have to revalidate every 5 or 7 years depending on the program, but that's less frequent than the verification process. So once we have the project validated and sort of registered, we'll generally take some operational data, usually around 12 months or a year of data, and perform the calculations, perform the quantification on the reductions, and then send that package to a third-party verifier who, again, reviews the calculations, they review the data sources. We go back and forth with them. Once we're in alignment, the verifier will submit that package to the registry. Registry will review it on their end, make sure it aligns with their program, and then once you get through that full process, the credits are issued. And so that initial process can be, again, you have the startup, we're usually collecting about 12 months of data, and then that verification process can be 6 to 9 months depending on which pathway we're pursuing. And then the expectation would be each kind of 12 months after that, the credits would issue. We're generally, in some cases, we're pre-selling the credits or attempting to. In other words, when the project starts, we're already marketing those credits to interested buyers, and they might sort of commit to purchasing them, and generally they are invoiced and ultimately paid upon delivery of the issued credits. So to jump to the next slide here, Graham. So yeah, just wanted to touch on some of the customers that 3Degrees works with and some of the folks that are active within this space. This represents customers that we work with across our different business units, so it includes some work in the renewable energy space and consulting and things like that. But just give a sense of, again, interested companies within the food and bev space that are looking at addressing their supply chain emissions. Also just wanted to flag that these markets are consistently evolving, and best practices around how to engage with the markets are consistently evolving. So we have a full-time regulatory team that's closely engaged with groups that are essentially defining those and those best practices, so that we make sure that our offering and our pathway when we're working with projects is aligned with what customers are ultimately looking for, and also being done in a credible way, just to sort of de-risk things for all parties. And yeah, you could jump to the next slide. Back to you, Carly, for some case studies.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. So yeah, I thought it might be beneficial just to run through a couple case studies here to kind of give some real world examples of what this potentially looks like. So this first one that we have here is our very first carbon credit project that we had go through. So this is a dairy farm that's in Washington State, and there are, I think, just over about 3,000 cows on this operation. We first started kind of talking with them back in about 2019, and really they came to us because they were interested in our first wave for manure and nutrient management. And then as we kind of got working with them, it was in about the same time frame we started talking with 3 Degrees, and so we thought, we offered to them and said, would you be interested in kind of being a part of this protocol development that we were doing at the time? And they said, sure, why not? Let's see where it goes. And so I think what's really cool about this example is, first and foremost, this was an installation based on manure management. They wanted to see the trucking savings. They wanted to see, the other additional benefits that come with an LWR system. And then we were able to, put through this protocol, and now they're generating credits. So again, they're about 3,000 or just over 3,000 cows on this farm, and they're generating around 10,000 tons of carbon credits every year that they're selling. And so again, their first carbon credits that they sold were in, I believe, 2023, and have been continuously selling those from their operation. And then, yeah, some of those additional benefits they really saw were, 400,000 plus trucking savings from hauling their manure. This farm had access to a lot of pivot irrigation systems, and so being able to have, that solid separation piece and left with a liquid that really didn't have any suspended solids left, they were able to really utilize that pivot system that they had in place. And so we saw some really big savings there. Another one that, just about every time we talk with the farm, they'll comment on this of how their neighbors will mention to them, we really don't have or notice any odor from your operation anymore. And that's been since the first wave system has gone in. So it really does lean into, the better community relations that you can have with your community after, implementing maybe the next stage of manure management technology like a first wave. And then the bottom one, I think we see this quite often on farms, specifically with flush systems, being able to recycle some of this cleaner water back through their operations. They're seeing, lower stomatic cell counts and mastitis. It's just overall promoting, some healthier cows are happier cows, and we can see some increases from the production side from that point too. So this was really an exciting project for us. And so obviously want to highlight, the first one that went in and that they're still going today, still generating credits. We'll go to the next slide for the second case study that we have here. And again, we're going to stay in Washington State. And this example here is a farm, Lash Legacy. They just installed their system just a year ago, February 2025. They installed their system, and kind of an opposite, kind of right from the get-go, they had interest in doing carbon credits on this operation. And they were really interested to look at, what was the availability to put a system in and have access to carbon credits without, having to have a bigger capital cost up front. And so this is where, they were able to install a system through the adoption of our Manure as a Service program, which I am going to talk about just a little bit later on in the presentation, so we can get kind of into the details. But for this farm, they're about 2,000 cows, and they're generating around 15,000 tons of carbon credits. So for those really paying attention, we see a smaller herd size, more credits in this case, versus the first case study, we had a larger herd size and about 5,000 less credits. This really, shows the point of it's that baseline calculation that came into play here. So, some differences here. In that first case study, they had liquid solid separation in place already. They had some mechanical separation through some screens, and then they also had a centrifuge in place. And so they actually took their centrifuge out to put in a first wave. But having all of that previous separation, they were already removing a percentage of their suspended solids. And so that was taken into account into that baseline calculation. And so we did see, a slightly smaller number for credits per year that they're going to generate versus here we see obviously, about 2,000 cows and seeing more credits that they're generating really comes down to what does that baseline look like? And so again, we really dig into that with farms as to, what does that operational history look like? What do you have currently? What's the plan to put an LWR system? And how much solids with an LWR system do you want to remove? Do we want to take everything out, or maybe from the nutrient management side, we want to take a little bit less out. We work through all of those calculations with you to really dial in, from an economic standpoint, what does this look like for your farm? And we want to make sure it makes sense. So this farm, again, being able to access this through our Manure as a Service meant they had a zero CapEx installation and ongoing optimization. And so that really helped them, still access carbon credits, just in a slightly different kind of financial model that they had. But because of having all that data collection, really the system, automatically tracks and reports those CO2 reductions for the farm. And they, don't have to themselves be keeping all of those records. All of that is taken care of throughout the system. We'll go to the next slide. And just kind of to touch further on, kind of overall projects. This slide is just showing you we're at about 6 projects that we have between LWR and 3Degrees for carbon credit projects across the US, as you can see. So we've got 2 in Washington, some on the West Coast, some more kind of the Midwest to the eastern side of the US. And they're all, kind of in varying stages of development. Obviously, we have some that, have been generating credits since 2023. So about 3 years now that they've been doing that. We've got some that are just kind of kicking off their process right now. But altogether, looking at those 6 projects, we're estimated to be generating around 75,000 tons, 75 to maybe 100,000 tons a year of carbon credits from those 6. So it's very exciting to see, these numbers come together, and we're very excited to help, expand this and do more projects. The goal is to just kind of grow this more and more so that we can really showcase the improvements that dairy farms, are already doing, the next steps that they're taking, and kind of showcasing that more of these steps of what that actually means and being able to validate that through this technology. So the states that are highlighted in blue there are the states that LWR has installations in. So you can see, we're pretty across the board. So it's, if people are interested, we're always happy to have people out to site and to talk to farms and to see, okay, what does this look like? How did carbon credits work from your perspective? It's always nice to get that kind of firsthand from those farms. But we will move to the next slide. So yes, we're going to chat a little bit more about, some different financing models. So again, from LWR side, we really wanted to look at this as, how can we make this accessible to more farms to be able to access the carbon credit markets? As myself and Ryan have kind of touched on here, this is, a very growing industry and market space that we're seeing. And because we have these companies, that have set these goals, whether that's 2030, maybe even 2050, it's not really going anywhere anytime soon because they have these goals that they're trying to meet. And especially when we're thinking, from a supply chain reduction aspect, there is, again, a lot of those emissions are within that scope 3, and that's what the farm fits in. And so we want farms to be able to access this opportunity that's available to them. So at LWR, we kind of have about 3, ownership models that we offer. Obviously, your first one, the immediate ownership of equipment. This is your capital investment up front to have the equipment. With this, you're installing the equipment. You have full ownership on that equipment. LWR comes in. We do, the startup, the commissioning. We'll do operator training so that you know the ins and outs of your equipment and how to run it. And then we can be there, from a service perspective throughout the year as needed if it's required. The next option we have is lease to own. So we do have a few different leasing partners now that we're able to bring to farms so that if there's interest in wanting to put in a system, but maybe, that initial CapEx isn't available right now, we can look at, some different leasing terms, whether that's a 5-year, 7-year, maybe a 10-year. We have a few different options that we can look at. And as the name suggests, LWR has ownership on that equipment until that term is done. When that term is done, the farm then retains ownership fully of the equipment, and it's theirs forever, for however long they want to keep it and keep running it. And then our third option that we have is the Manure as a Service program. And so again, this is, relatively new in the last couple of years here for LWR. And this is really to look at the zero CapEx investment side and shifting that over to, a monthly operating cost for their manure management. So it's signing up to do that monthly operating cost or payment every month. And the equipment, same thing, gets installed. We're still there throughout the whole installation, commissioning, startup, operator training. And then the farm takes over and is operating the equipment, and it's supported by us at LWR. So there's maybe a few more touch bases in there where, we're coming in, maybe it's every couple of months to do some optimization visits. We're there checking in quite often on how things are running, making sure everything is running optimally and to the best of its ability. And so that's just kind of opened the door up as another option. And with that Manure as a Service program, then we do look at kind of a carbon credit share model where LWR gets a percentage of the credits and the farm still retains a percentage of the credits as well. So that there's still, some revenue coming in to the farm for the credits that are generated. So again, at the end of the day, our biggest goal here is that more farms can have accessibility to the carbon credit market space. And, our goal is to try and find, those buyers within that supply chain so that we can hopefully look at marketing to, the most dollar amount that's available to these farms. So that you can access this because we have the evidence now, with 6 projects on the go right now. We've got farms that are doing it right now, and it's an exciting time for sure. We'll go to the next slide. I think now. So as we're kind of coming closer to kind of the end of our presentation, I wanted to just touch kind of quickly on a couple of things here. So first, I think I've touched it a little bit in some of the case studies, but just wanted to talk a bit more about it again, is about the additional farm benefits of the LWR system. Again, I would say 9 times out of 10, farms are coming to us because they're wanting a manure management solution or a nutrient management solution even. And so there are, a lot more benefits to the systems. And then really we like to think of it as, the carbon credits is that additional piece on top that the farms can get, and really viewing it as that revenue opportunity for these operations. So some of those additional benefits, can be that increased nutrient control, increased crop productivity. We have seen herd sizes grow even within that second case study, the Lash Legacy dairy. That was a goal of theirs was, implementing an LWR system was going to allow them to grow their herd size by a couple hundred cows. And so that's, a possibility for these operations. And we can even see the off-farm sale of nutrients as well. Through that liquid solid separation, we're seeing some concentration of nutrients and farms being able to sell that off farm. And then of course, from the cost saving side of things, being able to decrease that overall hauling cost, is probably the number one reason we get calls from people is wanting to help alleviate that. But we also see, nutrient losses decreased, odors decreased, the mastitis, somatic cell counts. We're thinking flush systems within these barns. There's a lot of additional benefits that altogether add up and help, really make and drive the economics on these projects. And then, that carbon credits now, again, like I said, is that next kind of piece on top, which kind of leads me to the right-hand side of the screen is the opportunity that we're seeing now as we move forward. And I guess really kind of what we're forecasting to see is the ability to, stack credits on top of each other and see, that reward for the sustainable practice that we're adding on. So obviously today we talked all about carbon credits, but we're seeing, in addition to that, your feed additive adoption is a great example that's already in the market space today. We even have a farm, one of our 6 projects, is already feeding that feed additive that has been proven to reduce methane emissions. And so, he's getting a carbon credit for that. And now he's looking at doing carbon credits on top of that. And so we're able to see, that stackability component to these credits. From LWR's perspective, another kind of new exciting avenue that's just under development kind of recently as of 2026 is looking at water benefits and assets. So thinking water quality and water quantity side of things. We'll kind of alleviate a little bit more into our second wave technology that we have. But looking at, the ability to stack, another asset or credit on top of that carbon credit while still using the same technology and data collection that's already in the system. And a piece that I wanted to kind of add on, it didn't make it onto the slides, but around digestate credits as well. That's very much in our brains right now. We're working through, how we could look at this, of looking at post anaerobic digestion, treating the digestate that comes out. There is still, some volatile solid that can come out in that digestate. And so if we're looking at, treatability, separating out those solids, can we see that little bit of further methane avoidance taking place there and how we can fit that in? So that's another avenue that's under development for that protocol that hopefully we'll see in addition to kind of the list here of opportunities that we can add. So it's from an LWR perspective, digestate, is we've seen the treatability on this. We have systems installed treating that already. And so it's how can we add, again, another revenue opportunity for those farms and sites to be able to access this. So I think with that, I'll shoot it over to Ryan again to kind of wrap up as an overview.
Yeah, thanks. And Graham, you could jump to the next slide. So, yeah, just to recap, I mean, 3Degrees and LWR have been working together on this since 2019. We're seeing increased demand both on the dairy side for picking up this equipment and installing it, and then we're also seeing increasing and steady demand for offtake for the reductions from these systems, both in and outside of the supply chain. And so, yeah, this is just a very initial primer, and I think both Carly and I are happy to go into further detail with folks who are interested in learning more both about the LWR system and also how these carbon markets function. So, yeah, thanks everyone for attending, and I think we'll do a Q&A now. Graham, if you want to tee that up.
Yeah, absolutely. As Ryan said, thank you so much for attending, everybody. Um, it looks like we had one Q&A come through that Tree briefly addressed, but Ryan and Carly, I'll give you a shot at it as well. This is from an anonymous attendee. So the carbon credit has to be generated in a state that allows them, or is thus assuming they are not generating RINs? And you can take a look at that question in the Q&A, or Shri, if you want to speak to it briefly, please feel free.
I would just say it's likely in this case that this is a contemplating an install post an anaerobic digester, and so I think that that does as Carly mentioned, it changes the available crediting pathways, and so usually best to dig into those on a case-by-case basis just to make sure that there's no double counting and things like that. So, but yeah, happy to dig in further and look at any specific examples.
Awesome. And for that question asker, if you want to dig in with someone on our team, everyone's email address is on the screen right now. Here's one. Can you talk a bit more about how the data is recorded by LWR and 3Degrees? So I assume this is referring to on-farm data.
Yeah, I can start from LWR's perspective. Throughout the first wave system, we have various sensors that are installed and come with the equipment. And so there's an ongoing data collection from those sensors as the system's running. I believe it's about every kind of 5 minutes, we're grabbing data on, the total suspended solids, pH, conductivity, obviously all the various flow meters throughout the system. So we're creating and generating all of that data, or collecting it, I should say, of, again, all of that manure, coming into the system, and then everything that's coming out. We're looking at essentially two spots that we're collecting data on, the inlet and the outlet, and then storing that and being able to share that over to 3Degrees.
Awesome. And here is another one from an anonymous attendee. Have you sold any LWR generated credits or enter into long-term purchase agreements?
Yeah, we've sold or in some cases pre-sold credits from all 6 projects that Carly mentioned. And then in some cases we have entered into long-term purchase agreements in the sort of 3 to 5 year time span. And I would say that that's just another thing that we're seeing a little bit more of in the market is an interest in, from buyers to lock in longer term contracts. Again, it kind of gives them that certainty that the reductions are going to be coming as they stare down, 2030 or beyond targets. Um, yeah.
Hmm, got it. And Carly, here's one maybe for you on that on a similar sort of data question. Uh, could you just talk? This is anonymous attendee asked, so farms are not having to collect data. Could you just talk a little bit more about the role of the farm in the data collection process?
Absolutely. So in the ongoing, once the LWR system is installed, no, the farm is not having to manually collect that data themselves. We have that automation built in. When we think of the baseline information that's needed to calculate out that baseline, there is some obviously historical data that we need from the farm. So through different records that we have, which Ryan can probably talk a little bit more of, maybe some specific examples of things that they like to see. But typically we start out kind of, if you're interested in a project and anything, we do kind of an initial questionnaire with farms, just kind of go through the basics of, okay, what is your setup? What does that look like? That typically kind of off the cuff they can answer that just kind of really quickly and fill it out and send it. And then we get into, the full validation verification process to have that kind of previous historical operating data, as typically the farms, have that information already. But yeah, Ryan, if you have any more comments on that, feel free to kind of jump in. But after LWR is in, that's all an automated process.
Yeah, I would say the biggest lift from a data collection standpoint is often at the very beginning, going through that first validation. And then oftentimes we'll set up like a automated or close to automated process with farms where, every month they're sending the same spreadsheet that's downloaded from their, herd management system or something like that. So trying to, once we kind of iron out a process, make it as low lift of an effort as possible. And there are also there's an annual, site visit typically that is part of verification, where we need obviously the farm's support and approval for that. Um, but yeah, I think as Carly mentioned, trying to automate as much as possible, but definitely still need that, some of that ongoing data from the farms.
Awesome. And just again, a reminder to everybody, if you have further questions or if your question hasn't been addressed yet, Carly and Ryan's emails are on the screen. So feel free to grab those and shoot them a message. Ryan, I'm guessing this is a question maybe for you. What's the split of these project credits between offsets and insets? Is Vera certifying both? And maybe this is an opportunity to talk a little bit more about the role of organizations like Vera in all of this.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I would say historically before maybe 2025, it was mostly like the voluntary carbon market was the pathway and Vera, yeah, all credits within the voluntary market ecosystem would be issued by Vera. Um, More recently, I would say the split is um more like 75 or even 90% of interest coming from supply chain markets with, still a little bit of interest in the voluntary side of things. Um, in the quote unquote insetting market, right? There's not a single kind of best practice established right now for how exactly to verify and issue those reductions. So it's a little bit more of a, buyer by buyer case. And, that's something that our team does is really understand what are the requirements from the buyer. How can we make sure that we're delivering to them exactly what they need, but not, necessarily delivering things to them that they don't need, right? Like if there's fundamental differences between what's required under a voluntary carbon market versus what customers are asking for in these supply chain markets. So um, in some cases, Vera still might be, we might still be pursuing a Vera pathway. In other cases, we might be, still pursuing third-party verification, and then using a different registry. But it all comes kind of back to the buyer. And one thing that we do, try to do in cases where we can is essentially keep both options open for the farm, right? In other words, even though supply chain buyers are um, more of where the market is coming from right now, we want to make sure that we can still preserve a voluntary carbon pathway so that in 5 years, if the market shifts and now all of a sudden the voluntary market is more uh is more bringing more revenue back to the farm, we can still access that pathway for farms. So we're conscious of trying to preserve that optionality.
Got it. Here is another question, or if there's any that are jumping out to either of you, Carly or Ryan, that you want to address, feel free. But one that I see is, does the revenue from the carbon credits offset the polymer cost for the system? And maybe you can talk about revenue a little more broadly. I also see a question just asking about, can you talk about payment? When is this made? How does that work?
Yeah, I can touch a little bit from the, does the revenue pay for the polymer? Absolutely. And that is, our number one goal for projects is to, ensure that that payment is covered. Again, when we think of, those additional benefits, there's a lot of savings that can come with those additional benefits that I had mentioned. And so I would say even the majority of the time, the either cost savings or maybe new revenue opportunities outside of carbon credits can really cover that overall polymer cost with it. So that's absolutely yes to that question. From a payment side, if how I'm reading it is more from, getting paid for carbon credits. So maybe Ryan can touch a little bit more on that.
Yeah, so I think in that earlier slide, when talking about the timeline, there's generally a delay in that first issuance, right? So you're starting a project, collecting, usually around a year's worth of data, and then going through the verification process. So um, it in that first kind of startup period, it could be 18 months or depending on the pathway, potentially longer before that credits are issued. Generally, the primary payment comes in once the credits are issued. Um, to bridge that sort of initial kind of startup period, we often will work with farms on sort of a prepayment, just to cover some of the ongoing operating expenses associated with the system, and try to, yeah, again, kind of bridge that gap between system startup and that first issuance of credits. And then from that point, it's usually an annual timeline from there.
Fantastic. One question that I see from Tyler is, can you touch on the opportunity of water credits? And I think Tyler is speaking to sort of in the context of data centers and water usage, but maybe just more broadly, that going back to that idea of stacking different credits on top of each other, if one of you could speak to that.
Yeah, I can take a stab at it to begin with. Absolutely. That's, what we're really is driving this from our side to look into this. And like I said, we're under development right now, looking at what that protocol is going to look like from a water credit or water asset aspect. Again, we're kind of looking at probably two different avenues for opportunity there of, water quality. So really looking at the nutrient runoff aspect from manure applications, and then water quantity, looking at, the recycling of water on farm, and having that reduction of pulling from water sources, whether that's, surface water or from subsurface water. And then, yeah, seeing that, there's what we're seeing anyways in the news is, some maybe closer proximity of these data centers to agricultural spaces. And so from our viewpoint, we're seeing there's probably a really good synergy there of, how can we kind of branch that or put a bridge in between the two to say, look, there's farms here who are implementing this sort of sustainable technology, looking at recycling water, reducing that nutrient runoff. How could we fit together kind of into that same space here? So it's, as I said, under development right now, but hopefully something that's going to be coming in the near future is the goal. Of seeing what we can have for that opportunity for those. But from our point, we're really looking at kind of two different branches of that: water quality and water quantity.
Fantastic. Um, we have time for a couple more questions, but first I just want to address Scott in the Q&A. Carly, I see you're also typing. Scott, we will be sending out a recording of this, and LWR will also be following up after the webinar. So you'll be hearing from us, and anyone who registered will also be hearing from us. This is a question that just came in from an anonymous attendee. What happens if there's an issue with data collection, i.e. sensors being offline or needing repair?
Brian, do you want to touch on this from that aspect? Your
Yeah,
guys'
so
point of view on it?
yeah. So I think understanding, I guess first of all, it's kind of getting notice when that happens. And then I think there's like obviously mechanically and operationally there are different parts of equipment that will need to be fixed kind of in the near term to keep the system running. From a carbon credit perspective, if sensors are down or if meters need calibrated or something like that, there are sometimes like stopgap solutions that we can use either via like more manual testing just to kind of prove separation efficiency or flow rates during a time when the sensor might be down. So there are certain workarounds that we can work on with the farm to make sure that we're not losing all of the credit volume. But I would say it's important, yeah, that we get a heads up. Oftentimes we will just through LWR, right? Because they're collecting some of that data. But yeah, if this, important sensors or meters are off for an extended period of time and we don't know about it, there is a risk of losing sort of that, duration of time's worth of credits because we just can't prove to a verifier what happened on site during that time if we don't have the data.
Yeah, from LWR side, as Ryan kind of pointed out there, because we're collecting all that data, we are watching and seeing things. From our head office, we can kind of see into those systems to see on a daily aspect, how are they running, what's going on. We send out kind of weekly analytic reporting to our farms as well. And so it kind of shows you a recap. And so at the very least, on a weekly basis, we are noticing things, but typically on a daily basis, we're just kind of logging in quick to check on what's going on. And so we can see something pretty quick of, oh, if the sensor's gone down or it's maybe not working or it's, showing some kind of crazy numbers that are out of the norm, then there's probably, maybe even a maintenance item of just having to clean something to get that sensor kind of back and up and running again. So there's lots of touch points are happening kind of from both sides from LWR and 3Degrees, but yeah, the goal is obviously to try and catch those as quick as possible to try and avoid farms missing out on potential carbon credit.
Fantastic. Well, folks, we are at 10:58 Pacific. So I think that about wraps us up. Carly and Ryan, any closing thoughts?
I don't
Not
think so.
really. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would just say these are great questions. A lot of times the sort of annoying but true answer is case by case basis, and Carly and I are more than happy to address it on a case by case basis as well. So, um, I think it's oftentimes best to do, as Carly said, go through that questionnaire, get kind of that initial estimate of credits, and we can help model out, what the project looks like from that front.
Yeah, I would very much say, reach out after. Again, emails are on the screen. So if you have further questions, things are always happy to help answer. And if you're, someone who's very interested in carbon credits and things, happy to, kind of kick that off with that discussion of what potentially that could look like at your operation. And then, yeah, as you know, we've said, we did record this. So we will have this available and we'll send that around to everyone. So you have a copy of it. You can go back and listen to us talk all through this again. And then we'll have it maybe posted maybe on our YouTube channel for sure, I think, from LWR side. So you can direct if you have someone that you know that's maybe interested that couldn't make it today. You can direct them over to there to check it out.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both so much. And thank you to Shri for being in the chat. And then just one last call out. Please feel free to contact Carly, carly.lewis@livestockwaterrecycling.com to get any of your sort of initial questions answered and fill out the questionnaire. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us and have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.